the replacement of thought. If one looks at Circle Junction from the bird's view, one would see a large series of lines marking the old world rails merging and looping around a central circle by which the location is named. In the days of old, that circle was the center junction, if you will, that diverted the trains in all directions to different states, and even different depots in the massive rail installation. In the days of the Legion, that circle made up the interior fortress, home to the Interfector's personal palace, and the many nearby warehouses within the facility remained home to the 500-plus legionaries who occupied the city. If we go further out, you would see the many more surrounding industrial facilities once used for storage of transported resources and repair work on the old trains, now used as shops that continuously poured their smoke into the sky as new weapons and equipment for the soldiers on all the Legion's fronts were made. Beyond those factories and going further out were the slave quarters, a sprawling city created from scrap of the old ruin and worked together with wood and debris to contain the masses. This slave city was erected over time and was constantly growing as the wire perimeter had to be moved by the week to make room for more and more victims of Legion expansion. Upon leaving the city, a person would find themselves in the corners of either Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, or Utah, depending on the direction they left. But that would be by no means the end of Legion control in the area. On the fringes of the Circle Junction region, and in all directions, was the locations of many camps that shared a similar purpose with the city itself, fueling the Legion. Though there were a multitude of different camps in the area, the most important camps within the Circle Junction territory were those that created soldiers like Aileron and Montano. Now, Aileron and Montano were a common type of soldier, especially in this period of Legion history, ones that were created by the Legion, not born into it. It is true that the Legion took in the young, and had camps specifically dedicated to breeding soldiers from the womb. However, whether the conquered man was 10, 12, 16, 22, or even 30, all who were not born into Legion were so thoroughly destroyed after they entered the camps that they might as well have been born again upon exiting. Though there are many rumors and plenty of mystery behind what exactly created the soldiers of Caesar, here is what is known about those who fell to the Legion only to become its vicious warriors. Have you ever heard a lie so many times that it becomes the truth? It is seen in abuse, in adolescence, in life itself. Suppose you were abused as a child. Suppose every day your father came home drunk and proceeded to verbally and physically abuse you. You would hear words and phrases like, "You are worthless," "You are a waste of breath," "You don't matter," "You shouldn't have been born," "You were a mistake." All of those things are lies. And perhaps some even use words and phrases like that as inspiration to be better or to remove themselves from the abuser. But those words, after hearing them enough times, become a part of your being. If you think about what exactly thinking means, you may come to realize that thoughts are only a series of images, sounds, smells, and everything perceived in your life being brought up in the present by your mind, whether it is to compare a bad situation with a current one, a good time with another good time, or even a sense of love in a present period in your life that is currently without that feeling. You may smell a wonderful fragrance that brings your mind back to a time where you smelled something similar as you held your love. You may hear a new friend in the present thank you for something, and you smile, remembering other times you've helped friends and received their gratitude. There may also be times of great hardships being endured in the present, and the mind transports itself back to a time that you overcame, perhaps allowing you to stay true to your course, knowing it will soon be over and the good times are just around the corner. These are the thought patterns of a man who enters the Legion camps. A man, a tribal, a prepper, raider, mercenary, or waster enters one of Caesar's camps with their mind remembering everything in their life, leading up to the moment they are escorted up to those gates to a Circle Junction soldier camp. Their mind is almost entirely occupied by the fresh memory of what happened to their tribe or family, and the pain in their limbs from the forced march. There almost isn't time to think about anything other than that pain. Many can't even think about the fear or anxieties about what's in store for their immediate future. When they come to a stop outside the gates, they remember the feeling of warmth and the sensation of their mother's embrace, only to be reminded of her death at the hands of those masked soldiers staring them down. They think about the sweet kisses from their love, and then remember how she was ripped from their arms and sentenced to a life of rape and birthing children they would never see. They look to their left and right, see many familiar faces, and silently give comfort to those who can't handle the situation, or look to others who remain vigilant and silently plot schemes of rebellion or means of escape. They then look at the masked faces of the victors, recall all the horrors done up to that point, and feel powerful when the marching stops. There's a brief period of recuperation where those schemes are devised in the brain, and with those memories of all the injustice, they say to themselves, "I will never bow to Caesar." They look at those masks like the villains they are, and are ready to fight for that life they watched get pulverized from existence. Then they hear the echo of the loudspeaker beyond the walls of the camp. The new victims of Legion expansion are unchained from the transport beams, and some resist, only to be brutally beaten back into submission by the voiceless and faceless men who have been waiting for a chance to spill blood. The new slave soldiers are stripped of all their clothes, black bags are placed over their heads, and those who protested are either pummeled into unconsciousness or slaughtered for disobedience. It wasn't uncommon for the image of a friend being cut open to be the last thing a person sees before being stripped naked and blinded. A last image of a life formerly lived, a life that ended, a life that never even existed in their mind after being escorted through those gates and hearing that speaker get louder and louder. Similar to the layout of Circle Junction, most Legion soldier camps were shaped like a circle, and the new slaves are escorted into the outer ring. The naked and blinded men are escorted to the perimeter or outer ring and placed in one spot as the shouting and horror continues in the world directly outside the bag. But the words of the loudspeaker are the only clear words the blinded man can hear. They have no idea where they are, but they hear the abuse, hear the footsteps stomping to and fro. And the only thing they can think about is the happy but difficult life they lived, and how it ended. All those memories repeat on a loop in the dark bag while that loudspeaker continues to speak. They feel the sun beating down, only adding to the agony and sleep deprivation of the forced march. Many are hungry, and none of their captors know what mercy is. At some point during that first day, and when all the captives are standing in their spots within the outer ring, the speaker is silenced for the moment, and a terrible voice orders the blinded to repeat after the speaker. The voice sounds like that of a monster, a behemoth. The voice sounds so wicked and cruel after only being able to imagine it from within the mask, and after hearing all that terror leading up to the silence. The person still complies, only temporarily, since they fully intend to use that time in the bag's solitude to plot their escape. The loudspeaker comes on louder than before, screaming the words, "I am worthless. I am nothing. Caesar is all. I deserve death." And so many other self-derogatory phrases that are all interspersed with statements about the perfection of Caesar. Many repeat the words as instructed, and it goes on for so long during the heat of the day that many collapse. And it usually isn't too long before some rebel and attempt to remove the bags from their heads and look for somewhere to run, only to see the mass of Caesar surrounding them that have been watching all of this. The blinded and naked men are completely powerless, obediently repeating after the loudspeaker, but hearing the horrible beatings of those who defy to their left and right. It becomes very clear to all who are within the blinding mask that it is safer to remain blind and endure the repetitious words, while they can only imagine what's being done to create the blood-curdling screams of those who defied. All who hear but cannot see pray that the footsteps of the soldiers in red don't stop before them. The terror around them and the loudspeaker merge so smoothly with the thoughts and images of the person inside the bag. Hours upon hours go by, and the loudspeaker never stopped. All that's left are those who continue to repeat the words, since most who would defy had already been killed at this point. Eventually, the footsteps stop in front of you, and you're terrified. You had been good. You've been repeating the words the whole time. Of course, you were still trying to plot your escape, but you hadn't been given the chance. Alone in your thoughts, you recall the terrible sounds you heard done to your friends hours earlier and cry. How did they know you were plotting? They wouldn't have stopped in front of you if that wasn't the case, right? The bag is removed from your head, and all you see is a man in front of you with a Legion mask and a fan of red and black feathers across the top. He's holding a tray of food. The first thing you see after hours inside the bag is one of your tormentors offering you the thing you've needed. He places the tray on the ground as three other masked faces aim their guns at you, and a canteen is placed in your hand. You raise the canteen to your lips at the man's motion and say thank you, being genuinely grateful for the gift. Before you can taste the water and squat down to eat the food, a fist is delivered to your stomach. You had not kept repeating after the loudspeaker, "Thank you," were not ever words that came over the PA. There in the sand, with walls to your front and back, you see the line of your blinded friends standing there repeating after the PA, while the masked men beat you for what feels like hours for failing to comply with the directive. Alone in the world with the men who are trying to kill you, there is no saving grace. Your friends lining the outer ring are too alone in their heads and complying to help you in any way. Eventually, the beating stops, the tray is stepped on, and the canteen is poured out onto your head as your mouth was filled with sand during the beating. You are hauled up onto your feet, bloody, broken, and emotionally destroyed. And the last thing you see before the bag is tied again around your head was a small tent behind your standing marker, and the fact that the sun was a lot lower than it was before the bag came on. At night, the slaves of the outer ring are given 4 hours of sleep, and the loudspeaker blares louder than during the day. Floodlights are turned on, and each slave is given a restless 4 hours to sleep, allowing the message of the PA to enter further and further into the man's mind, as rest is made impossible by the continuous abuse and uncooperative conditions. You then rise from your tent, or are dragged out of it, and the bag is thrown over your head once more as you stand in the same spot to repeat the same words again and again and again. Meals were given twice a day, and many of those meals were destroyed for failure to follow the simple directions made nearly impossible by sleep deprivation, starvation, and dehydration. Your brain fails to communicate properly with your extremities, and your brain is reduced to the simple thoughts, "Don't make them hurt you," and "I am nothing, I am worthless, Caesar is all." You try to think about that rage and hate towards your captors. You try to plan your escape, but more pain is inflicted upon you for failing to follow an order you didn't know you weren't following. Many can't handle it, and some hand themselves over to their tormentors entirely from exhaustion or early mental destruction. Some think suicide is the merciful choice when they're alone in the mask, and all they can see is the what was, and how it will never be the what is, again. However, you hear the people who've given up, and their deaths didn't sound any better than the hell you're in right now. You cry again inside your mask, trying desperately to remember what it feels like when your mother hugs you, but all you can think about is her brutal end, and repeat the words, "I am nothing. I am worthless. Caesar is all." There are no rests to relieve yourself. You're already covered in your own waste or standing around it, making that message from the loudspeaker more and more true. I am disgusting. I am savage. It's feeding time again, and you're allowed to eat by your tormentor, making you feel accomplished, only for that feeling to be destroyed when another merciless pummeling comes your way after regaining enough of your strength. There is no correct action. As the punches and kicks land all over your body, you repeat the words, "I am nothing, I am worthless, Caesar is all." And just before being dragged onto your feet for another several hours of standing and speaking to the darkness of the bag in your mind, you realize this is only the second day. This is the routine of each man who goes to the legionary camp for an entire month in the outer ring. Standing and repeating the phrases of the loudspeaker, suffering physical abuse, and only allowed enough food and water to remain alive while you remain sleep-deprived and blinded, left alone in your thoughts. Those thoughts becoming more and more replaced by the message of the loudspeaker. Some may be asking when the machete training comes in, when the new slaves learn how to fight, how to kill Caesar's enemies. To that, it should again be reiterated that a soldier of Caesar is rarely a volunteer, especially in this time. Soldier camps in this period were overflowing with those who've had lives before the Legion came, lives worth fighting for when facing down Caesar's endless hordes. This practice was a means of erasing everything a person was, letting them know how that reality they remembered is gone, and how that reality will never exist again so long as the Legion lives. After a month of standing in place and getting the new message of your being pounded into your very soul, the conditions of that world are shown all over your body. You've been naked the whole time, body blistered and burned beyond belief from the sun, standing there in the heat, rain, and all conditions, surviving on so little and enduring the worst humans imaginable. This is what your life is. All the while that message repeats, reminding you that you indeed deserve this, and all the abuse done to you was due to your inability to comply with the victors. Stuck with your thoughts and unable to see anything aside from those few moments the bag is removed, you've seen the same thing again and again. Whether you saw that line of your friends bagged and standing in the rain or heat, you see the same image again and again of who exactly has the power in this world. You lost track of the days after less than a week, and your mind and voice has been repeating the same words on an endless loop. By the end of the month, you are entirely convinced that this is all there is in life, to comply or to be destroyed. You may not have agreed with that message at the start, but the brain typically functions based on what it knows to be true. Again, thoughts come from what you've seen, smelled, heard, experienced, and all those thoughts you had when you were blinded by the bag became more and more proof that this existence is all that is true in the world as you. Repeat the words, I am nothing, I am worthless, Caesar is all. After an entire month of that, a person is usually so mentally destroyed that some are not able to say anything other than the long series of words that made up the loudspeaker message. The bags are removed, and the slaves are then escorted to the inner ring. The inner ring can more or less be described as the same thing as the outer ring. The slaves are moved through a series of gates where they then take their place on new markers. Again with a frayed old tent behind them to pathetically shelter from the elements during the continuing 4 hours of authorized sleep. It again wasn't uncommon even at this stage for people to pass out from standing in place and being given such miserable conditions, but still, they are hauled onto their feet after an expected beating. The biggest difference between the inner and outer ring is the bag. The bag is no longer forced over the heads during the days of standing and repetition. Instead, the slaves face the wall of the final sector of the camp, each spot lined with paintings of the Legion bull on its blood-red background. The slaves take their spots and stare at that banner. The loudspeaker comes on again, and more phrases are repeated on an endless loop. The conditions remain unchanged, but the removal of the bags is not licensed to look around. Many have already mentally succumbed to their captors by this point, so the thoughts of escape upon entering are no longer there by the time they reach the inner ring. Everyone knows there is no escape, and all are thankful that they no longer are stuck inside the masks, alone with their brains. The world is still horrible, but the pain of that world remains at a distance as you stare into the golden bull. You still hear the pain of that world being inflicted upon your friends. Who even are those people? They never helped you when you were being beaten. You aren't even helping them when the world is beating them. You just want the pain to stop and pray it doesn't come for you. However, you know that so long as you stare at that bull and repeat how worthless you are, you remain safe. At least until you aren't. The masked faces stop in front of you again. Internally, you beg them to go away. But they don't. You scowl even more as you stare into the bull and you scream, Caesar is all, but the men don't leave. You scream the words from the PA again and again, the blood shooting to your head and your body in agony from the sun's blisters, but still they remain. All you want is to stare at that bull, and you don't want the worldly pain to get in the way again. If the world tries to prevent you from saying the words, true to Caesar, you'll kill it. You see those glimpses of what happened to your friends and tribe, your mother, and what happened each time the bag was removed from your head only to see the people you thought would help, standing there in their masks, free from the pain you're going through. The blood in your veins boils as those faceless men stare you down, and you scream louder than before. Caesar is all. Eyes fixated on the bull and ready to kill, you remain sleep-deprived, dehydrated, and half-starved, but still you say to yourself, if they prevent me from saying Caesar's name, I'll fucking kill them. The thought astounds you. At what point did you go from, I'll kill these people for what they did to my family, to I'll kill them if they stop me from doing what I'm told? Suddenly, a bag is thrown over your head, by some unknown figure from behind. Your body is pummeled by the familiar sensation of fists and boots, and still that fire in your heart burns as you remain naked and powerless against the world outside your view of the bull. That bag is removed again, and standing above you is the feathered helmet, but the way he's standing is not like the other times he harmed you. He's standing winded, and you hear something being dragged away, but you're too weak to turn and see what it is. He reaches down, lifts you up with one hand, and places a canteen in your hands. You cannot see his face, but you know the look on it. He saved you from something. Before you can turn around to look at the figure being dragged away, you notice the other legionaries are gone, and the man with the feathered helm raises his hand towards the image of the bull. You repeat after the loudspeaker, "I am savage. I deserve death. Caesar saved me." For 3 weeks, slaves remain in the inner ring, staring at the bull, ready for pain, ready for punishment, and continuously repeating new messages from the loudspeaker. Still sleep-deprived, mostly starved, and continuously dehydrated, you stare at the bull, only seeing that world of horror in your peripherals. Blistering heat, freezing nights, and heavy rain, you stare at that bull, unable to recall the past, or anything outside the terrible world you're now convinced is all there ever was in this life. Stare at the golden bull. Say who you are. You may have the occasional thought, "Who am I?" The only answer you know is, "I am nothing." You remember your hate for those who captured you, and remember how all their abuse came from your own failure to follow directive. Then you remember it was them who gave you food. It was them who abused you. It was them who put you here. But then you remember the taste of water, and you hear the words, "Caesar is all." Caesar is the sole reason for everything good that has ever happened to you. It was not him who abused you. It wasn't even his men who abused you. It was yourself. You think back to those first thoughts you had upon entering the camp. You vaguely recall your mother's embrace, and it only makes your rage grow, not towards the Legion, but to her. She's the one that birthed you into this awful world of plague, war, death, famine, and hate. It's her fault you ended up in this hell. You think about that first kiss with your love, and remember how it was care for her that made you stand up to the Legion in the first place. You hate her for her beauty. You remember how that beauty only tormented you when you were blinded, and how her haunting image in your head terrorized you in comparison to the world you're now convinced is all there ever was. Those recollections of a life before are so vague at this point that even though they are rapidly fading, you hate everything that ever led to where you are now, without the ability to focus that hate on the true tormentors, because after all, I am worthless. Caesar saved me. Caesar is all. By the end of your time in the inner ring, the image of the bull is still the only thing you see when you shut your eyes, and that world remains terrible around it. So long as your eyes are on the bull, the world stays away. But if that world encroaches, the men who harm you reward you after the bag comes off and you're dragged back onto your feet. You finally come to realize that they have not abused you ever. Not even at the start. They kept picking you up time and time again. Everything that led to the hell you live is to be hated and slaughtered as your eyes only see the gold, and red in your mouth repeats the words that identify what you are, worthless and nothing. The answer to all that terror and your removal from it has been repeated by your mouth 10,000 times over the past 2 months, and you are able to recite each and every one of the 100+ phrases you've spoken, heard, and felt in the hours you tried to sleep. You are not your own. You are not a person. You are nothing, while Caesar is everything. You deserve death. You deserve pain. Caesar is the one who makes the pain go away, while everything else, including yourself, is what has given you pain. Finally, the end of your time in the inner ring has come, and you are escorted away, mentally annihilated, and physically destroyed. You wonder where they are taking you, but all you can see is the image of the bull and those masked men escorting you nothing into the final stage. You don't know this is the final stage. You have no idea what would be in store for you since the moment of arrival, and you rapidly lost the ability to contemplate the future over the terrible weeks and months that distorted your perception of present reality. As that image of the bull occupies the entirety of your vision, you are a sun-blistered, malnourished walking corpse, and a festering blob of misdirected hate towards everything that put you in Caesar's hands. You are totally unable to place the Legion as responsible for any terror by your brain's perception of the reality created in the words you've said again and again and again until they became the truth of your life. You pass a series of gates with all those people who entered the camp with you, who also remain trapped in their unending hells. You approach the concrete building of the central room, the last stage before your reality is finally consumed by the bull. You enter the pitch-black structure, and everyone in your group is posted to their spot within the walls. You can't see anything, but the arms of your captors guide you as if they are the only ones who can see in the world of blackness. You've been staring at that image of the bull for so long that even in the darkness, it's still all you can see, even while the arms lead you further and further into the structure and that loudspeaker gets quieter. You hear the door close, and you realize that the light from outside was actually calming in the room you saw as completely black. However, the closing of that door made you realize just how dark the place really is, but still, all you can see is the bull. The arms grabbed you, and you've long since had the ability to fight back removed from your being, so you remain completely resigned to it when the arms pin you to the walls and chain you there. There you remain, for 3 whole days. The tormentors leave you alone after chaining you to the wall, and all to be heard is the silence and breathing of the men in your shoes. You hear them, but you cannot see them. You cannot even talk. But still the words of that loudspeaker echo in your mind again and again in the complete darkness. You cannot hear the loudspeakers themselves because the walls of the enclosure are so thick, but you still hear them loud as day as your mind repeats them in the silence. The words crept their way into your subconscious being over so long, and in all the darkness, that image remains while the breathing continues. You had been killed. This place without hope or light is death. The images that had been replaced by the sounds of the loudspeaker flash in your mind again, and you hate everything you once loved and stood for as you try to recall the true cause of the pain you endured. You think of how everything in your past led to the torture and then death of you yourself. You begin to vomit as you try to recall love and those who gave it to you, again, only remembering where everything that wasn't Caesar led you. The central room was a place without time, where 5 minutes in the black were equivalent to years of psychological pain when the memories hit, only to be destroyed by the new thoughts that are now who you are. You feel the years pass until a hand reaches out and touches you. It is still impossible to see it, but your attention is gathered and you feel a canteen be raised to your lips. Alone in the void and unable to lift the canteen due to your restraints, you feel the water rush down your throat and the canteen draws away. You remember and understand what it's like to be in the mother's womb, fed and kept alive by something you do not understand, but something you belong to. This time is different, though. You do not want to be born into that world of horror and torment that landed you in the place you ended, but something is different. You know that world, and know you died in it. You died before knowing that Caesar is all. But now you know the new truth, and you're ready to come out of the dark, not into the light, but as an agent of the dark, as a soldier of the dark. All you know in preparation for your birth is that Caesar saved me. Though you have no way of knowing it, 2 days pass in that room, and you've spent the entire time being nurtured in darkness while your brain festers with hate at the existence that put you there. Completely understanding that Caesar is responsible for all things good as the image of the bull remains. Then the 3rd day arrives and your thoughts are removed by an unbearable pain that consumes your entire body. Your body and head is beaten and kicked in the pitch blackness, and you've long since forgotten there were others in the room. You feel the pain. It feels familiar, but you can't seem to connect this pain with that of the beatings before entering the room. It feels as though phantoms are harming you, and you can't remember what people even look like since the pain is so unbearable. It doesn't stop. It continues on and on until you are no longer conscious, which feels like something entirely different when you were already in a place you thought was death. Then you awake. When you awake, you find yourself in a bright world. No loudspeaker, no torment, no torture, no heat of the day. Your body is still broken, but as your eyes adjust to the light, you see the men of Caesar looking down at you. You feel your surroundings and feel the bed you're on, believing what you went through was a nightmare until you look left and right to see the slaves who were with you laying in similar beds in the bright open room. You look back at the soldiers of Caesar, and there is no fear in you. The only difference in those men from the ones who harmed you is that these men are not wearing masks. They wear the helmets, but they do in fact have faces. You realize this for the first time. Suddenly, the man in the center asks, "What is your name?" You had already been killed before and already lived a nowhere life that led to nothing but pain and death. Being asked your name, you entered a new world where you have no identity, but know how horrible that existence outside the Legion was. You look down at yourself lying there on the bed and see yourself wearing the black kilt and red tunic of a legionary. You have always been Legion. You always were. You just didn't know it. You try to recall the life before one more time, but even thinking about that makes you sick when the images of that torture flash before your eyes. You feel the rage boiling at thought of your old life, and you know that someone chose you to be born into this world again. Survival, food, water, shelter, comfort, all comes from Kaiser in a world and environment that did not care for you. Kaiser was responsible for saving you. Past memories only led to the terror of the camps. Kaiser became the sole reason for everything good, while that deep burning hatred towards everything done to you remains inside. But what to do about that hatred? The words, "What is your name?" echo in your mind once more, and all you can say is, "I am nothing," while knowing deep down that Kaiser is all. That soldier of Kaiser then looks down at you, points to the uniform you wear, and tells you on behalf of Kaiser himself, "I am to change that." The next 2 weeks are spent in a separate camp located further away from the initial camp and out of range of the booming loudspeakers. Those 2 weeks are spent testing the new soldier's ability to carry out even the simplest of directives. There are ample opportunities presented for those to escape this separate camp, but there are no accounts of anyone ever attempting that. After the Black Room, a man has had all of his thoughts completely removed and replaced by a new thought pattern that always circles back to a hatred of anything not Legion, and always back to the man responsible for everything good that's happened to them, Kaiser. By the time they leave the room and awake in the uniform of Kaiser, most men are so thoroughly destroyed psychologically that they don't even remember their names, especially if their name somehow reverted their thought train towards memories of that life before, that they now so hate. Language is not entirely important for brand new recruit legionaries, since most are forbidden to speak in general. Those who barely know the English language are not spared from things like the loudspeakers, since the message is still more than clear in that first camp when torture is regular from the legionaries and the environment they were in. Where language fails to influence some, circumstance more than makes up for that. With language and speaking being secondary in a world that demands them to die for Kaiser, simple orders are responded to with simple words. Other words are introduced to the newborn, such as the Roman ranks that make up the Legion, and a person learns to talk once again in a way that is only in confirmation to the word of Kaiser, while derogatory to everything not Kaiser. Outsiders are dissolutes and profligates, while everyone Legion is servant or superior. Superiors are to be honored as the representatives of Kaiser they are, while profligates are to be destroyed. It is also said that it is because of this language facet that Kaiser picked Rome as the model for his totalitarian nation. To start, many of Kaiser's conquered spoke in tribal dialect that evolved from the popular Old World Spanish language. Being a child of the Latin language, Spanish words were relatively similar to many Latin ones, and this made for easy introduction of new words to the conquered's vocabulary. The Roman model remained familiar to grasp, yet so foreign to the English, Spanish, and tribal speakers of the region that it was ideal for maintaining a disciplined culture in which every word had weight. This all said, the 2 weeks after that initial camp are spent testing the recruits' ability to follow orders, while ensuring the work of the prior camp was firmly cemented into the recruits' beings. As it pertains to the language, new words, ranks, and ways of speaking are planted into their brains. While the torment at memory continues long after the 2 weeks, it becomes clear to those men that their thoughts have no weight when spoken into existence and enter the ears of a man who's also learned that Kaiser is all. After the 2 weeks of familiarization with the Legion, and after learning how their sole purpose in life is to benefit Kaiser who pulled them from captivity, the man remains a festering object of undirected hate. It is subliminally planted in their minds who that hate goes to, and at the end of that 2-week period, the new recruits march out to other centuries across the Legion's fronts, ready to destroy the world that put them in Kaiser's camp in the first place. The soldiers march to the fronts, bursting at the seams with hate and ready to savagely throw themselves against all who oppose Kaiser, barely armored, barely armed, but still set to die once more. Even if they can remember their old name, a name is not given to the recruit until they've survived long enough to be in need of some sort of address. The notable savages in Kaiser's ranks become recruit decani and exercise the leading of their fellow savages against the ranks of Kaiser's enemies. Over time, and after enough interaction with other soldiers of Kaiser across different campaigns, the man has learned more and more through experience in what they've done since being born again. By the time a recruit decanus becomes a prime legionary, they are more versed in the world, more strategic in their dealing of matters that involve those who aren't Kaiser, but that foundation of their being remains the same their whole life. Kaiser is all. No matter what's thrown at them, life or death has no meaning when they remember what was done to them and how they've been programmed to know, not believe, that the world was what hurt them. On the battlefield, they wear the masks, feeling safe from exposing their internal weakness to the villainous world. They look at their brothers to their left and right in the dust and sand, all masked, and waging their own physical battles against that world while simultaneously battling their own mental war of isolation in service to Kaiser from behind the mask. A friendly rendezvous. The shaggy-headed and ragged man in the withered slave tunic leaned himself against a support beam. He stood there looking out at the busy activity of the Circle Junction, Colorado sector streets during the midday shift change. There was still several minutes before he needed to start heading to his assigned workstation when the slave with the gray hood took his place on the other side of the same support beam and spoke inconspicuously to the ragged man on the opposite side. You see, they've been rounding everyone up. The two watched a crowd of other slaves take their seats against the wall behind them, as they watched the streets fill up even more with new slaves leaving their workstations for the brief rest. The shaggy-headed slave responded with a slight shake in his voice. "Fuck, man. Of course I did. Why do you think I've been out these past few days? I'd had to make a break for the Utah sector. Thank the gods I know a guy over there who could get me out." The hooded man said, "Good. That's what I heard. I was a bit worried they might have got you, especially since I'm sure you heard." He paused, letting his brother in bondage respond with the news he already knew. The super talked. "I heard about that as well. Forge here has been closed down since." The hooded man replied, "He talked. Now it's only a matter of time before we're all screwed. You ain't thinking about turning over yourself, right?" Still looking out at the street, the shaggy-haired man wanted to beat the hooded slave, even for the question itself, but knew better than to make eye contact as a patrol of legionaries passed by. When they were far enough away and merged with the crowds of slaves exiting their stations, he said to his hooded accomplice, "Of course not. I know they just rewarded the super for show. He'll be killed, just like everyone else involved. Fucking Interfector just thinks he can incite more traitors with the amount of gold he's throwing at those fuckers." Immediately, the hooded slave said, "Exactly, that's why I got this." The hooded slave then took a step forward and ever so subtly revealed a small handgun tucked into his coat, probably a 9mm. Noted the shaggy slave. Returning back to his incognito spot against the post, the ragged slave watched his accomplice and said, "I thought they seized all the guns after the water tower was locked down. I thought they said all the guns were destroyed after they found our cache near the forge. Where can I get one? The Interfector has my name if the super talked, and now I'm just waiting for them to call my ticket. I'm fucking fucked, man." The shaggy-haired slave's voice was getting more and more frantic with each word, as he knew what kind of menace was coming his way since the collapse of their operation. Just then, the hooded slave calmed his partner with the words, "Quit your worrying and quit talking so loud, you'll be fine. They managed to get one crate out of there before the lockdown. Just try to find Marco when you get a chance." His partner interrupted, still slightly unnerved. "Well, what's next then? The operation's fucked and they're on to everyone. I feel like they'll bag us on shift at any second and I can't take it anymore." The hooded slave was quiet for a moment, letting his on-edge partner collect himself again before saying, "In my opinion, there's no recovering this one. I say you got two choices. You can either find Marco and take as many of them down with you when they get around to your name, or you can be like me and do what I'm figuring." "And what are you gonna do?" asked the shaggy-headed slave, slightly more collected. "I'm getting the hell out of here," said the hooded accomplice. "All right. When and where?" asked the other. "In about 30 minutes, actually. Pretty much as soon as this shift change ends." The ragged slave nearly laughed out loud. "Oh yeah? And how you gonna do that?" "See that man across the way over there? The one eyeing us?" asked the hooded slave. His partner looked across the street and beyond the moving crowds of transitioning slaves. There he saw a man leaning against a post as well, and occasionally glancing their way. "That guy over there is Philemon," said the hooded slave. For a second, the ragged slave was taken aback. "Wait, you mean the Philemon?" "Not so loud," snapped the hooded slave, louder than his partner ever spoke, and still barely enough to pierce the noise of the crowds. The hooded slave continued, "He's our ticket out of here. You want in or out?" "I don't have a weapon or anything," said the shaggy-headed slave. "I'm afraid this is a take-it-or-leave-it situation now. Find Marco and wait till they call your number or get the hell out of here with me and Philemon. He got himself transferred to Circle Junction just to get us and whoever's left of our movement out if shit hit the fan, which it did. He's been laying low for weeks, but he's seen what's been happening in this sector and is ready to get whoever he can out. He's coming over to grab me any minute as soon as the station switch ends, and apparently has a way out of the city from some secret tunnel under the sector's smelter house." "Well, how do you know you can trust Philemon? For all we know, he's taking us to that tunnel where the Interfector is waiting for us," asked the ragged slave. The hooded man responded, "Why do you think I got that piece? Philemon is a legend, but if somehow the Interfector or even that fucking super got wind, I'm more than ready to blast either of those fuckers on our way out, preferably both of them. Philemon too, if his escape tactics and legendary rep are from the Frumentariae." The shaggy slave pulled on his hair nervously and scratched at his arms, obviously still unnerved, but he still replied to his accomplice, "All right, fine. I'm with you. Making a break for it seems better than waiting for them to fucking grab me. I can't fucking take this anymore." Both men were silent for a while, as the slaves around them began standing up and filing towards their workstations as the shift change drew to a close. As one more patrol of legionaries passed, the man across the street named Philemon pushed himself off the wall with his shoulder ready to make his way towards the man he tasked himself with liberating, as well as the additional insurrectionist. The hooded slave then pushed himself off the beam as well, and his partner continued to pull at his hair and scratch his arms, still terrified about the sudden new plan. "Oh man, we're never getting out of here," muttered the ragged slave to himself as Philemon took his first step onto the ashy streets. "Lose the attitude, we'll need good ones, and for you to act natural if we're getting out of here," snapped the hooded slave. "Have you ever met the Interfector? He isn't one to let anyone like you or I escape, let alone let a man like Philemon into the city," said the ragged slave in nearly a cry before adding, "He's probably watching us right now. I don't trust Philemon," in a frantic tone as his nails tore more into his arms. "Quit your whining, and when the hell did you meet the Interfector?" said the hooded slave to his nervous colleague, letting that question hang rhetorically before focusing on his real determination. "I'm actually praying I see that fucking elite at the end of the tunnel. Been wanting to let him know what I think of him since I started this movement, but right now Philemon is our ticket, and if the Interfector found out, I'll be more than happy to put a bullet in his head." Philemon was halfway across the rapidly clearing streets when the shaggy-haired slave collected himself in an instant and said to his accomplice ever so coolly, "I'll be sure to let Lord Interfector know your true disposition towards his leniency." The hooded slave froze in place as Philemon continued his approach. As the words of the ragged slave entered the ears of his accomplice, He immediately turned around to draw his gun. However, the slave he thought to be unarmed proved to be anything but that, as 3 shots were put into the hooded slave's side within half a second. Before Philemon could reach them, or process what happened right in front of him, 3 more shots rang out and the bullets entered the escape specialist's chest. The streets were mostly clear by this point, and those few outside were rushing into the nearest buildings at the sound of those gunshots, while legionaries from across the Colorado sector ran towards the sound. Before anyone could arrive, the ragged slave turned over his collapsed friend in the hood and found the man coughing up blood while the side of his tunic grew redder. He began sifting through the pockets of his hooded accomplice, and there he saw the man still alive. Upon seeing the victim's rapidly whitening face, the hooded man sputtered the words, "You too, huh?" The ragged slave stood himself back up, looked down at the man he'd known oh so intimately over the months, and replied without emotion, "Never was, friendo." Dalton slicked his shaggy slave hairdo over to the side and pressed it down with his palm, leveled the handgun, and emptied the rest of it into the hooded slave's head. As soon as the gun locked back, he tossed it onto the body and calmly got down onto his knees with his hands behind his head. As soon as he interlaced his fingers, a swarm of legionaries kicked him to the ground, threw a bag over his head, and dragged him away. The Interfector stood in the interior fortress plaza with the rest of his staff and looked up at the large neon sign he had placed over the giant train accommodating doors. He angled his head and asked his senior staff friend, "I did tell the craftsman to make it say Interfector's Palace, not Interfector's Place, right?" Aileron responded to his Primus, "I believe so, Lord Interfector. I would say the sign still looks quite nice." The Interfector angled his head the other way and considered how nice the sign looked despite the error. "Yeah, it does, but place sorta makes the interior fortress sound like a hip new hangout spot. Sounds like a place you might go to smoke fresh cigarillos and listen to some newly recovered tunes on a jukebox. Not a palace that honors the strength of Caesar's elites and exemplifies the worthy subjugation of the worthless. I was really hoping to have the thing ready for our next auction," Aileron said in an appealing manner. The craftsman got the color scheme right. Muttered the elite, still disappointed despite the pretty color scheme of yellow and red neon. "Shall I have the craftsman brought before you for judgment, Lord Interfector?" asked Aileron. The elite thought for a long moment, angling his head to see the sign in different ways and possibly grow to like it. "Perhaps. Hold that thought, though. We have plenty to do before the auction, and I'll want time to determine whether or not that error was a simple mistake on mine or his part. Still, see if you can't have some of the boys get up there and maybe throw a spare A from the scrapyard between the P and L. It won't look right, but it'll at least show Caesar I'm not complacent if he happens by." "Noted, my Primus," said Aileron, before he grabbed up 6 passing child legionaries and gave them a brief order on what to fetch from the NM sector scrapyard. The Interfector studied the sign again for a moment and turned back around to his now 12-man personal staff. "You all are dismissed. See to the stage prep if you haven't been given any tasks for the day." The gaggle of legionaries dispersed, many of them heading towards the stage where a couple dozen slaves and child legionaries were busy constructing it. Meanwhile, Aileron stood beside his elite, always at the ready, and the duo surveyed the interior's plaza, watching the setup for tomorrow's big auction. Suddenly, a centurion approached the duo and placed his fist over his heart as he addressed the elite. "Ave, Lord Interfector. True to Caesar." The killer turned his head towards the officer and returned with a simple, "Hail, Caesar. What's up, Cassius?" His mind more focused elsewhere, the centurion replied straightforwardly, "My lord, there was a gunfight between some slaves in the Colorado sector an hour ago that led to the deaths of 2 and 1 survivor who says he'll only speak to you. The slave has withstood all interrogation methods currently used, and we're requesting permission to start removing appendages." "That's what that sound was?" asked the elite, thinking about those unusual gunshots he heard in the distance around an hour ago. "I thought it might have been more rabble-rousers. Where did the slave get a gun?" The centurion responded, "That is unknown to me or Decanus Aurelius, who's leading the interrogation. Your directives currently state your direct handling of insurrection activity in that sector, so I offer your presence in seeing to the matter." "Lead the way," said the elite as he motioned for Aileron to follow him. The 3 approached one of the interrogation chambers underneath a barracks within the interior fortress, and across from the Interfector's place. Outside the door, the elite saw a simple man in slave rags with shoulder-length hair hung down over his face. A rather normal sight for a person in such a predicament, but still ugly to look at for a man like the Interfector. The man's face still concealed by his long hanging hair, the elite entered the room as soon as the decanus across the slave delivered another punch to the grody personage. "Enough with the tough stuff, decanus," questioned the elite after the directive. "Aurelius, Lord Interfector." "Decanus Aurelius of Phoenix," responded the decanus with a salute. "That's right. Fantastic title by the by. You'll have to tell me about it sometime, but quit hurting my poor little servant right now." "Of course, Lord Interfector," said Decanus Aurelius of Phoenix before stepping out of the room at the Interfector's sweeping gesture. When all but he, Aileron, Centurion Cassius, and the 3 customary veteran guards were alone with the slave, the elite began, "You know, I've read that this land used to have a law or rule that allowed just about every Tom, Dick, and Harry to have themselves a good old firearm. That law doesn't much apply to these lands under this banner, so I'm curious, where's this time machine you stepped out of?" The slave still hung his head low and remained silent. This wasn't unusual since the Interfector wasn't like other Legion interrogators. The Interfector continued, "It would appear that a slave with a gun missed his target. I'm assuming you had a motive to kill some of my boys in red, or even me for that matter, given what's been happening in your sector as of late." The slave mumbled, "I wouldn't hurt one hair on my big boy's precious head." "What?" shouted the Interfector, bewildered that a slave would say words even close to those, especially to an elite like himself. As the elite contemplated how and where to harm the slave, Aileron drew his blade ever so slightly, ready to begin removing fingers when the slave looked up with the widest grin. "Hey, killer!" "Dalton!" screamed the Interfector, his scowl instantly turning into glee. Dalton tossed his hair to one side to better reveal his face, as the Interfector continued, "Dalton, my word, how've you been? I ain't seen you in what, little over a year?" The Interfector ordered the legionaries in the room to unbind Dalton, and Centurion Cassius was briefly updated on who the slave was. The Interfector asked Dalton if he wanted reparations for Decanus Aurelius's interrogation, but the man declined, saying he was used to a bit of torture. The Interfector dismissed the soldiers who brought Dalton in, and together the 2 friends and Aileron exited the interrogation room, up the stairs of the barracks, and across the busy plaza back to the Interfector's place. Aileron and the Interfector immediately headed up to the elite's abode while they gave Dalton time to clean himself up. It was there that the 2 were occupied with papers like they've been so many other times when Dalton returned. Upon Dalton's return in Legion attire, he began telling them about everything he's been up to since leaving for the Frumentarii and how he was recently captured by the Legion. Little did Aileron, or the elite, know, Dalton was sent to Circle Junction around 4 months earlier to track down and investigate a slave who went by Philemon. The slave never drew any attention from anyone other than who he let, but wherever he was sent within Legion territory, the number of escaped slaves in that area increased. Although it was at Circle Junction that Dalton found the budding insurrectionist movement, and though Philemon wasn't hard to find according to Legion ledgers, getting proof of the man's involvement with escape activities was something that needed to be earned through trust from those even in the slave ranks. Dalton essentially had to prove that he was a slave who opposed Caesar. Dalton earned this audience with Philemon by helping out the insurrectionists in whatever way he could, but always with a caveat. Dalton was too low on the ladder to be a prime suspect within that movement even after the slave supervisor talked, but when enough info was leaked to the interior fortress. And after the Interfector took appropriate lockdown measures, the movement fell apart. Only Dalton and a few other conspirators were left when the organization came crumbling down, and those few, like the nameless hooded slave, were urgently seeking their one way out, through Philemon. With the location of the remainder of the missing weapons to arm the slaves, and with knowledge of men like Marco who'd been hiding them, the jig was up, and Dalton ended the last leader of the Colorado sector movement, as well as his initial target, the captivity escape artist named Philemon. All this said, the day itself was one for celebration for the legionaries of Circle Junction. The elite and Aileron thanked Dalton for essentially wrapping up the Circle Junction Praetor's biggest headache, and there was still so much to talk about. "So you didn't have any trouble taking out the Brotherhood at the Maxon bunker?" asked the elite of his friend. "I already told you. The Circle of Steel wasn't any issue after getting the Brotherhood's help in the matter. As for the Brotherhood itself, I for sure left my true allegiance out of all the negotiations before erasing them. The Interfector asked. So, once the circle was dealt with, how did you deal with the Brotherhood then? Dalton went on. You already forget why you sent me to the Frumentaria? I mean, no offense to Alaron, but he wouldn't be nearly able to grasp the kind of tech that the Brotherhood has. Hell, even I barely could. For helping them deal with the Circle of Steel Raiders, our common enemy, I was good pals with the BOS. Can't say they made me a paladin for that, haha, but they let me in their bunker. From there, it was just snagging a few keys and initiating the silent self-destruct. Luckily, the kind of mainframe in that bunker had similar encrypted security measures to the old Enclave ones I remember. So from there, it was just a little trial and error until all those brothers of steel were buried alive, haha. How long did it take for you to do all that? Asked the elite. The whole operation took about, the COS was handled in about a month. And from there, the BOS was wiped out in about, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 days. So probably a month or so to take out both. This was almost immediately after the Frumentarii training as well. The Interfector said with a grin, Caesar definitely knew I'd send the right person for that job. Can't thank you enough, Dalton, said the murderer with pride in his friend before asking. And then you came straight here? Also, Alaron and I saw your name in a Palati report around 2 weeks ago. What's up with that? Sorta, replied Dalton. Frumentaria status has me free as a bird for the most part, provided I'm still working a mission. When I'm not under order, however, it usually isn't too long before a courier finds me and gives me new orders or updates. I was seriously in the middle of the woods on my way back to Flagstaff to report in with the Palati there, since I had no idea who I was supposed to inform about my completion of the Brotherhood mission. Swear to God, I was who knows where in the woods when a random waster approached my fire, who turned out to be another Frumentarius, who tasked me with the Philemon assignment. Sorry I didn't tell you I was in town, by the way, but I was on mission and didn't want to blow my cover. Still, I was overly set on making a trace with everything I did for those insurrectionists, so thankfully your patrols were able to report the movement's activities to you. From there, it was just dominoes falling into each other until here we are. But what about the Palati? Dinero says you're still there in Flagstaff. Fucking Dinero, haha. You'll be pleased to know he hasn't changed a bit, said Dalton before adding, Frumentaria are always technically still at the Palati, just like Caesar, but 90% of those potential Praetorians are just Frumentaria agents. You didn't hear that from me, though. So did they make you a vet deck out of the school? Asked the Interfector. Of course, but assignments can take me anywhere under any alias or rank. The murderer's grin widened. So the Palati won't mind if I make you my part-time senior or optio when you're in town? Provided I'm not stepping on Alaron's shoes, said Dalton as he caught the eye of Alaron and gave the man a wink. Congratulations on the promotion, by the way, Alaron. Alaron nodded at Dalton with a smirk. Thank you, Frumentarius. And of course not, you wouldn't be interfering as my senior in the slightest. It's a pleasure to have you back. You earned it, Alaron. From everything I've heard in the slave sectors, the Interfector's second is a real bastard, haha. You can always tell if you're doing your job correctly by the amount of inferiors you piss off, said Dalton, a statement all in the room agreed with through experience. Dalton continued, but I'm back at least until I get a new assignment, so I'll be your optio at least for now, killer. The elite's words were full of pride as he said to Dalton, well, welcome back, buddy, at least for now. The two officers still worked on their administrative reports while Dalton made himself comfortable at the table with his company before saying, So, looks like you're putting on another auction. What's the occasion? Yep, it's been a while, and we're looking to make the local settlements buy what they can, and hopefully get our hands on some good deals from all the local suppliers for the big Colorado push. From what I heard, it sounds like Graham finally squashed those guerreros of the Institute or whatever, and Caesar is mobilizing everyone he can across the territory for that big push, said the elite as he was writing out a long manuscript. What about the twin mothers? Are they still around? Asked Dalton. The elite stopped his writing and thought for a second about that minuscule back-burner issue he'd all but forgotten to address in weeks. Alaron? What's the current word on the twin mothers tribe? Alaron stopped his own writing and searched his memory for the recent status on that tribe east of them. Far as I know, they're still under auxilia status, although Caesar did tell us to keep them in mind before. You know, I'm honestly not sure what Caesar and Legate Graham wanted us to do about them, since the report didn't ask for anything other than a map of Mesa Verde and what little territory they got in New Mexico proper. "And we sent that map?" asked the elite. "Yes, Primus. The map was sent over 3 weeks ago, no news since," replied Aileron, assured of the task's completion, but also curious about the reason for the request in the first place. All of them thought for a moment before the Interfector said idly, "Sorta weird having women warriors at our backing. Pretty much all of New Mexico is ours now save for their little slice. Certainly not too many auxilia tribes out that way, but..." The elite trailed off, but returned his focus on the most relevant action needed regarding the twin mother's footnote. "I guess we'll just follow up on that demand. Caesar is a busy man, so I'm sure it just slipped his mind." He stopped before adding, "Aileron, would you kindly write a quick letter to our Lord and Master asking what he wants us to do about that twin mother's reconnaissance? No rush or anything, just wondering if he thought about them before the Colorado push. Mesa Verde could be a decent staging area. Anyway." "I'll write the letter immediately," Lord Interfector assured Aileron in his usual tone before the Interfector finished thinking out loud. Aileron began writing on a new sheet of paper bearing the sigil of the office of Circle Junction's praetor, and the Interfector resumed his work on that previous manuscript. Dalton asked casually, "So what are you jotting down, Primus?" The Interfector kept working, "Just the official list of properties to be auctioned off tomorrow. Meant to have it done earlier, but I keep getting pulled different places due to that Colorado sector nonsense." "Not anymore," said Dalton with another wide grin. The elite smiled in return as a child legionary accidentally knocked on the Interfector's large window. As the three men's attention turned to the noise, the child soldier standing on the ledge by a rope harness saw the occupied room, gave his salute to the three officers inside, and a giant scrap metal A was hauled up into view by a crane. "Good work, boys," shouted the elite through the glass, and the child soldier was joined by another who mounted the high ledge. Together the boys guided the scrap metal A into its spot in the adjusted sign. The fall of New Mexico. Centurion Montano stood atop the cliff overlooking the smoking battlefield. The plains of New Mexico were littered with the bodies of legionaries and guerreros alike, and the sea of corpses led to the distant conflict at the outer edge of ruins marking the old world town of Roswell. He and the other centurions were formed up, waiting for Legate Graham's messenger to give his directive to the officers of the 20th and 26th cohorts. As they waited, watching the distant conflict at the edge of ruins, they could hardly see the castle through the black smoke that poured into the sky across the land. The sun was high, but the sky might as well have been overcast with all the damage war had been doing to the region. Suddenly, a noise was heard behind the formation of centurions, and Montano turned to see a line of heavily armored centurions with gold-lined capes filing towards the edge of the cliff, every other man carrying an enormous rifle. Beyond them was Legate Graham gesturing every direction while the large staff around him listened intently through the noise of the Legion's staging area. Montano watched the line of heavily armored centurions take their places along the ridge and begin setting up their rifles facing the far-off battle. Montano was honored to be clearing the way for the first cohort. As previously mentioned, Centurion Therakos, Aileron and Montano's old superior, was transferred to the first cohort a few years prior. And now was one of the occasions the legendary unit was implemented. When a centurion has survived long enough in the Legion, they enter the first cohort, or go to become members of the Flagstaff Palace Guard. With limited roles in the Palati Vigils, most end up going to the first cohort, a 400-plus man unit that only came out at the directive of Legate Graham or Caesar himself for the sole purpose of destroying a dug-in enemy with all at the Legion's disposal. The first cohort was predominantly made up of the initial officers from the start of the Legion, later known as Caesar's Arizona veterans, or even the Red Oki Centuria based on actions in the Far East later on. The unit, even during this time, held a terrifying reputation. Montano watched the soldiers set up along that ridge, and just before Graham's messenger arrived at the front of Montano and the assembled officers, he watched another centurion wearing a blood-red mask with a fan of feathers going vertically across the top raise his blade. He saw the officer swipe the air and scream over the roar of distant chaos, "Fire!" In one report, the line of over 30 high-caliber rifles boomed, and the dust along that ridge grew into an immense cloud. but Montano saw the black smoke of the battle zone clear just enough to see the volleyed projectiles explode against the yellow stone castle before the blackness engulfed the region once more. The messenger stepped up to Montano's group and gave the simple order: rally your sentries and march forth. War drums all across the line began beating their slow rhythm as Montano began marching down the pass towards the assembled sentries with his fellow commanders. 30 seconds later, the long line of rifles boomed once again, and their high-caliber explosive bullets screamed overhead, exploding on the far-off castle. Montano was still too far, but he could faintly see the enemy begin fleeing from the force in the ruins, disappearing into the black smoke that grew more and more with each punctuated volley from the first cohort's guns. Montano arrived at the foot of the ridge. Those drums still beat, and Montano took his place at the head of the 32nd century. Helmeted but maskless, Montano was ready. Montano stood at the ready with his blade in one hand and a sawed-off shotgun in the other, and watched an elite centurion take his place at the head of the 10 assembled sentries of the 20th and 26th cohorts. With a flag in hand, a contubernium of drummers stepped before the elite, and not more than 30 seconds after Montano took his spot at the head of his personal century, the elite commander of his battle group fired a flare into the sky. One more report from those heavy guns atop the ridge, and the dual cohorts marched forth towards the ominous display of black smoke and carnage. What you would see from the ranks of Caesar's forces was the stuff of nightmares, but this was true tribal warfare. The guerreros del Instituto were strong, and though the fields leading to the ruins of the old world town were littered with bodies, and the abandoned emplacements of the guerreros' last resort weaponry, the slaughter had yet to truly begin. Further the cohorts marched. That smoky black nightmare ahead still echoed with the constant roar of gunfire and the screams of all in the killing pits. Stepping into the ashy and half-buried streets of the guerreros' home, another volley of the first cohort's heavy guns whistled overhead, and Montano led his unit through the smoke haze just in time to watch the rounds pelt the fortification. A tower of the Sallyport came crashing down, sending another blinding wave of debris across the land, while 1,000 soldiers of the combined cohorts washed into the old world ruins like another crimson wave. Still marching on, Montano wished he had his new mask or goggles to see through all the dust and smoke, but Montano knew to keep moving forward with his sentry close behind in column. Losing track of the elite he followed, and all the other sentries he'd seen in the field, Montano started seeing the legionaries of the first and second waves collecting themselves through the haze. Having completed their objective, and with mercy from the first cohort's cannons, the few who saw the passing sentries in the smoke gave cheers to Mars while a rallying drum beat its rapid tempo to inform the first and second wave legionaries where to assemble. Montano's eyes were still locked straight ahead as he led his soldiers onward into more concrete ruins and over wide piles of rubble. Suddenly there was a clearing, and Montano caught the gold-lined plume of the elite, who stood atop a pile of rubble just before the open stretch to the crumbled fortification. A horn blew from the elite's direction. Another flare was shot into the air, and the drums ahead beat faster as he caught the outline of the fortress walls beyond the thickest gray haze. As soon as that flare popped above, another scream of projectiles sounded overhead before exploding all across the fortress walls. More debris was filling the air, and as soon as Montano could see a clear glimpse of the walls, a line of machine guns started sputtering their opposition to Caesar. The flashes broke out all across the wall, all of them focused on the other sentries emerging from the smoke, and Montano immediately shouted over the roar of gunfire for his vanguard ranks. Montano stopped in place, and the vanguard consumed him into the ranks of his century, protecting the forefront with a wall of heavy shields reinforced with steel and stained in blood. Montano ordered the march forth, and bullet after bullet pelted the century's shield walls. Montano was just thankful that the initial pop of machine guns were focused on the other sentries emerging from the smoke, and he guided his unit onward, the gate getting closer as the wave's other sentries collapsed to the rattle of machine guns. Montano kept guiding his soldiers forward. Many of the machine guns now focused on the rear of his ranks, unprotected by the forefront shields. There was little he could do but keep moving forward. Onward he went towards that gate, now open from the fallen tower, and he watched the guerreros along the walls begin hurling stones upon the tops of his unit's shields, if not scrambling to counter the other sentries who'd begun mounting ladders on their sections of the fortress. Montano had lost half of his rear before his sentry was under the scope of those machine guns. Over the rubble of the collapsed tower they went, and the surviving horde re-established their formation before entering through the gatehouse. All seemed clear on the other side of the walls before another line of machine guns opened up from the opposite end of the fortress. With the vanguard's shields battered into oblivion, they didn't have to endure for much longer before a swarm of tribals fell into the gatehouse. Montano's sentry dropped their protection and met with the enemy in that half-crumbled gatehouse. The smoke was so thick and the guns and screaming were so loud, the distant command drums had since been buried by the immediate battle. Montano only saw red as he had so many times before, but this time was different. This time Montano wasn't carrying the flag on his back. This time, Montano was the symbol, the head officer of his sentry's strength and tactics. Tactics still being largely secondary to him. He knew that Caesar had placed him on the march to that gatehouse for a reason. Montano slashed and hacked away at the swarm of guerreros in that gatehouse savagely, protected from the silent machine guns by the hostiles in front. Montano's unit in particular excelled at close-range butcher's work. The only time Montano ever stopped cutting open the opposition in front was when he needed to reload his double barrel sawed-off. One by one, Montano and his surviving sentry created new corpses to fill the walls of this emplacement when it fell to Caesar. The sentries mounting the walls must have done their work excellently, because another swarm of legionaries came to Montano's backing in that gatehouse, unperforated by the machine guns. Still the carnage continued, and Montano's sentry was whittled down more and more, while their ferocity never stopped. Montano could just start to see the other end of the fortress, and dreaded the moment those machine guns on the far end opened up again, if those sentries under the 26 taking the flanks couldn't get through. Taking a page from Hannibal at Cannae, Interfectorem intended to wrap his forces around the enemy and trap all in an enormous killing pit. But Montano didn't know what kind of resistance the sentries were encountering on the fortress's flanks. When Montano removed his blade from the stomach of the last man, the rest of the guerreros were fleeing, and no more than a few seconds later, those machine guns opened up on everyone in the gatehouse again. Legionaries scrambled to the vanguard's dropped shields, or used the bodies of the fallen for cover, while many of the new arrivals were caught in the opening fire of those guns. As all inside the gatehouse scrambled for cover, Montano's Vexillarius was clipped in the shoulder by a stray round and fell to the ground with his upper armor half busted. Montano moved to the flag bearer, and before the man could stand, the Vexillarius was pelted 4 more times and ended his time on Earth in service of Caesar. Just in time, Montano lifted up one of the vanguard shields from under a few bodies and sat under it, while a spree of gunshots ricocheted off the heavy instrument. Montano was stuck and could not move, but under that shield, he saw a very young legionary lying prone behind several bodies. Montano watched a bullet enter the chest of that young legionary's cover, and Montano screamed over the continuing gunfire for the boy to move, gesturing clearly for the young soldier to take the flag. In an instant, the legionary crawled around the bodies as more and more bullets whistled overhead, and Montano shuffled over with his shield to give the boy more cover as the young legionary fidgeted with the flag harness under fire. As soon as the young soldier released the flag harness from the fallen Vexillarius, Montano was hit. Montano's arm had been sticking out from behind the shield as he moved to cover the boy when the bullet tore through and shattered his left arm. Montano collapsed, one of his arms now useless, and the shield lying on top of him as the bullets continued hitting all the bodies under that gatehouse. Montano felt himself drifting in and out as the pain in his arm was blocked out by his mind dedicated to service. Still, no amount of determination and personal drive could repair a recently shattered limb. Suddenly, all was silent under that gatehouse as the chaos beyond continued. Out of the silence from somewhere within the fortress itself sounded the word, Ahura. An explosion sounded just beyond the hostile side of the gatehouse, then another. Montano instantly stood himself up and bolted to the rear. Regardless of his pain, he saw the young legionary, as well as several others who survived the barrage, begin running back the way they came. The explosions crept closer, but Montano didn't dare look back, and suddenly, Montano was thrown to the ground as several large bricks pelted his body and helmet. Montano would thank Mars for the strength of his armor and helmet later, but at the time, Montano was knocked unconscious. Montano did not know how long he was out until he awoke to the young Vexillarius hauling him out of a small pile of rubble. The The faceless young legionary pulled Centurion Montano up. The second, Montano's eyes visibly fluttered open, and Montano felt he still couldn't move his left arm. Upon standing, he saw another group of legionaries, many of them completely covered in dust, and the young legionary now wearing the flag on his back. A nameless Decanus immediately noticed Montano's dust-clotted arm still hanging limply by his side, and began tying it off for good measure while Montano collected himself. The remaining 20 or so survivors from the exploded gatehouse saw Centurion Montano stand, and all looked to him and his new Vexillarius. Montano turned back where they fled and saw half of the gatehouse had been leveled, the entrance completely blocked, save for one beam of light coming down from some spot at the top of the rubble. Without thinking about it, Montano charged towards the rubble pile he retreated from, and his new signifer followed close behind, immediately followed by all the other dust-covered legionaries. Up Montano went, ducking under the fallen pieces of the gatehouse archway and through that narrow opening in the half-level tower. Upon emerging on top of the ruined gatehouse with his men, the machine guns on the far side opened up again, but the parapets of the fort were more than sufficient cover for where they were. As each legionary filed onto the top, many joined the ongoing fights across the roof to aid the sentries still scaling those ladders. Montano caught another brief glimpse of the box-shaped fort, saw the opposite tower, and all those sparks popping from the machine guns along the ground level. Montano felt safe from atop the half-crumbled tower for a moment, until he caught sight of an enormous group of guerreros swarming through the opposite gate straight into the fort. Montano still didn't know what to do with such a limited force, other than aid the taking of the walls his forces were already occupied with. Seeing that mass of tribals form up before storming the walls, Montano cursed the soldiers of the other centuries, assuming the tribal force he was looking at was the one that had repelled the flanks. Suddenly, Montano caught the young Vexillarius, ripped the flag off his back, and slammed the rods into the young soldier's hands with the brief order to wave it at the elite the way they came. The soldier did just that, and Montano turned back to look at the counter-attacking force. The guerreros were almost ready, and though the walls of this section of the fortress were now legion, they'd have tremendous difficulty in holding them if the amount of survivors was any indication. Montano turned back the way he'd come once more and saw the young soldier still waving the flag. Another flare popped in the elite's direction, and Montano turned back to the force, readying to charge one more time before he heard it. The drums were still beating along each sector of the attack, telling him that all of their battle groups were still intact, but something unique was coming from the direction of the elite. A set of heavy drums was beating slowly beyond the smoke haze, and just then a series of fife instruments started playing. This was a sound he'd only heard one or two times in his life, and that sound was immediately followed by the echo of trumpets, another nearly unworldly sound to him. All of a sudden, the melodic sounds of those far-off instruments became loud, and just before the guerreros began their charge towards the legion-occupied walls, the instruments picked up. The tune was somehow so loud, yet so buried by the gunshots and screams of battle, that the sensation it gave him could almost be described as pure magic. One more time, Montano turned back the way of those instruments, and there he saw it. Emerging from the smoke, debris, and fog was the entire first cohort was marching into the battle and up the ladders or over the gatehouse rubble to their own song. The march of the first cohort, the swarm of veteran centurions had entered the battle, just in time to meet with the guerreros' counterattack. In just about the most glorious display, the highest elite of Caesar's army met with the remaining horde of guerreros, and all who'd survived up to that point joined the ranks of the first cohort all along the walls. The blood, death, screaming, guns blaring, and whirlwind of horror swept the legionaries all across the battlefield into a nearly hypnotic state as the first cohort led the way for the legion's battered force. Bullets could only just barely stop a surge in morale like that, and Montano watched that Vexillarius waving the flag with pride as Montano continued to direct the survivors of the entire force along the walls on how to assist the first cohort's steady advance. The final wave of Caesar's elite cohort continued their slow march through the guerreros' ranks like a machete through neck tissue. The weaponry of the first cohort silenced those remaining gun emplacements and made the guerreros flee as the first never backed down from their own pleasure in melee combat. The chainsaws were revved up, and the buzz of spinning blades merged so finely with the ambiance of gunshots and shouts. The walls all across the fortress were painted in blood, as more work was done until just before noon. Right before noon, the screaming had stopped, the guns were silenced, and all to be heard was the sound of those rear echelon drums telling each group where to rally. The smoke began to clear, but the fires still burned all across the region, and Montano looked to the young legionary who pulled him from the rubble, who then proudly waved that flag in the face of defeat. He asked the boy legionary his name, just noticing the completely shredded fan of feathers on his helmet, and the boy said he didn't have a formal means of address. Montano at last noticed the battered armor and helmet of a recruit decanus beneath all the dust, and recalled his own staff was non-existent after the collapse of the gatehouse. Montano thought about a particular officer he served under, and how that officer got maimed in a fight somewhere in northern Arizona. An obscure lower-ranked officer in one of the century's prime contubernia took charge in the middle of the battle, and led his centurion's forces to victory when the man himself couldn't. That prime decan's name was Da Falco, and he became the commander of the 6th century after that act, and was the predecessor to Centurion Theracos. Being reminded of that incident, Montano looked upon the nameless recruit, who only identified himself as CCCXXV 325, a number from the nameless recruit ranks, named the young soldier Falco right there, and drafted the boy into his personal staff as the sounds of battle echoed into the distance. The day was won, but at a heavy cost. And the sounds of battle had slowly turned into the familiar sounds of assimilating the survivors of another fallen people. The survivors of the Guerreros del Instituto were rounded up by the veterans of the first cohort, while the people they failed to protect were pulled from their homes in the ruins of Roswell. Many fled, but few escaped, as scouts and reserve forces had been surrounding and patrolling the outer city, waiting for the battle to end. As the sun set, smoke and fire still engulfed the region, and the bulk of the legate's forces were busy reorganizing their ranks and dispersing troops throughout the fortress. Crosses were erected from the debris, and the resistors were dispatched, while Montano and all the other commanders of their respective centuries did what they could to refill their ranks after so many losses in the fight. Still, the fight was over, and the slaves and reserves from the legate's massive encampment congregated in the fortress walls. Montano met with Clara and Raquel, who treated his wounds with tribal remedies and wrapped his arm as the process continued. Montano ended up having to purchase the soldier he named Falco from a different century full of born-in legionaries that had been nearly destroyed in the first wave. As hinted above, it turned out that the young soldier was one of those who was born into the Legion, who knew of nothing else, and never even met his mother. Coming from a Circle Junction soldier camp that specialized in raising soldiers from the womb, Montano felt an odd sensation when he realized that the boy was no more than 16 during the fall of the Guerreros, and born only a year or so before Montano himself became part of the Legion war machine. The sensation was like a strange sense of unity with the young soldier. One generation of Caesar's servants had pulled another from the rubble and followed close behind in the advance, never wavering and never flinching as the flag was waved and the first cohort, the survivors of that very first generation, led the way to victory. Days passed, and the assimilation of such an enormous tribe was almost done. Montano's century was still undermanned by around 30 or so legionaries, but that was fine for the moment since New Mexico had fallen. The Guerreros were done, and southeastern New Mexico was firmly Legion. Montano's inexperience in leading tactically was made up for by he and his men's ferocity, and New Mexico would never be the same under the Legion. Of the nearly 300 New Mexican tribes absorbed into the Legion since the start of the campaign almost a decade prior, only 13 were deemed worthy of being marked on Caesar's list of the conquered, the Guerreros del Instituto included. When the smoke finally settled across the region, Legate Graham approached Montano's century doing their work within the fortress walls and stepped up to Centurion Montano. After deeming Montano's role in the battle as worthy of the highest praise yet again, Montano was told by Caesar's second, "Your century is granted a period of respite as of this moment. A runner will contact you when your force will be needed again, so take your century to the township of Gallup in the far west. After doing their duty at the nearby breeding camp, they are free to remain in town and rest until further order. I advise you to use this time to survey the land I've given near Newcomb, just north of Gallup. You have truly been a terrifying asset on this campaign. So, befitting the praise of Caesar, I have the pleasure to inform you that the mask you've been gifted is ready to be picked up at your earliest convenience. A messenger of Circle Junction's praetor has been instructed to meet you at the town of Shiprock with the gift. Wear it with pride, Centurion. You've more than earned it. And I'll look forward to leading you to more victories when Caesar moves on Colorado. Montano fell to his knee. Thank you, my legatus. There is no higher honor than serving Lord Caesar. The legate nodded and walked away.